It was a bright, warm September morning in 1958 when commuter train number 3341 was rushing towards Newark Bay on its way over to Jersey City. The train was filled with people from every walk of life, from former dean of NYU Law School to the Yankees' second baseman, George Snuffy, who was headed into the city for his first day at a new finance job. Some didn't even plan to be on that train. Such was the case with Mr. Land, who had considered playing truant that day, but in the end caught the train all the same. So on all counts, as far as the passengers or anyone else was concerned, everything seemed completely ordinary. Well, everyone that is, aside from George Berry. You see, George Berry worked on trains his entire life as a freight man who was an expert on track signage. He had just spent a long night in Elizabeth tending to a family emergency, and somewhat randomly ended up as a passenger. According to NJ.com, he caught the 3314 at 9:57 a.m. because, quote, it was the first train he saw when he got to the tracks in Elizabeth. Along the way, George noticed that the signal lights indicated the approaching drawbridge was open. In fact, the engineer ignored 3 of them. Then, from the window, at least one other observant passenger noticed that the Bay Bridge ahead was actually opened, yet the train was accelerating. Barry also looked out to confirm this fact and realized in horror that the drawbridge was wide open. His first instinct was to jump off the speeding train because, as he later recalled, quote, when the drawbridge is open, a concrete counterweight drops across the tracks, and the train will hit concrete. With this imagination of the looming catastrophe, he headed for the back door, which was blocked by people. So all he could do was turn to the back of the train and brace himself on the wall. But instead of a crash, the rear of car 932 started to rise as the front slid into the bay with a splash. Water rushed into the car, which was upright in the bay, and finally, Barry was underwater, pinned by bodies and running out of air. As he later recalled, quote, it was dark, and people were drowning around me, but I had a wife, 3 kids, and one on the way. I couldn't leave her alone. I pushed real hard and used the seat arms as a ladder. Suddenly, my head broke free halfway up the carriage. I remember looking back at the people still in the water, said Barry, who escaped with a few cuts, continuing, quote, I wanted to go back and get them, but I didn't have enough strength. I think about that a lot. Barry and his fellow passengers were involved in one of the most bizarre-looking train wrecks ever. As images of this commuter train dangling precariously into the bay linger, the world is left with countless unanswered questions. Why did the engineer ignore the signals? Why didn't the locomotive fail-safes work? And why didn't the bridge operator, who had adequate monitoring of the rails, attempt to lower the bridge? So stay tuned to find out, as today we examine the mystery of the New York Bay train disaster. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. When train 3314 impacted the murky waters of Newark Bay, terror ensued immediately. Witness Jeffrey Campbell recalls, quote, I was seated in the third car about halfway from the front. As we began crossing the bay, I felt the brakes applied violently. Then I noticed the car going over the ties. As the train turned into a wreck, the victims' clothing was literally blown off their bodies from the pressure of the water entering the wagon, and those who didn't remain within were launched into the deadly current. Rafael Leon, a 55-year-old Venezuelan financier, was holding hands with his wife at the time of impact. Sadly, his wife's hand slipped away forever, but this was not the Titanic, and the situation was not poetic. As news of this unthinkable disaster spread, panic set in for the families along the train's route who suspected their loved ones might be on board. By the early hours of the afternoon, New Jersey waited with agonizing uncertainty aside their telephones, afraid it would never ring. Each hour that telephone didn't ring increased the likelihood that it never would, revealing the scale of tragedy at hand. The wife and 6 kids of the New York Yankee player on board would never get a call, nor would they ever see their father again. They did, however, suffer the media coverage of newspapers displaying horrific images of the recovered carriages, complete with the victims still on board and visible through the windows. In the end, 48 out of 100 passengers perished. Recovery efforts revealed a disturbing reality: coaches in shambles, with luggage and human remains scattered throughout. George Snuffy and Howard Hunting of New York Times were also discovered within the flooded wagons, but many others were still missing, perhaps taken by the current. Among them was the CEO of the nation's largest corporation at the time, the All Chemical and Dye Company. Naturally, an accident of this magnitude struck fear in the hearts of commuters, and the public demanded answers. A massive investigation was carried out by multiple agencies, including the Interstate Commerce Commission, and in short, their discoveries ranged from likely to outright conspiratorial. One expert, John J. Brown, for the company that made railroad speed recorders, testified on the second day of hearings held by the State Public Utilities Commission, and his assertions were deeply concerning. As the witness pored over yards of 2-inch wide paper tape with a flashlight, he explained to the commission and an audience of 75 that the train actually did apply its brakes suddenly, about 3/4 of a mile before the open drawbridge. However, this application was only momentarily before the throttle was applied and the locomotive actually sped up to 45 miles per hour. This damning testimony was immediately challenged by the lawyers of the Jersey Central Railroad, but to little avail. The railroad's position was that Brown was inconsistent, and his previous testimony suggested a speed of 58 miles per hour. Brown clarified that he amended his previous statements to account for the free-spinning axles that would have recorded a drastically higher speed when the locomotives left the tracks. Although a major investigation was carried out, no conclusive cause of the accident was immediately uncovered. After a deep examination of the tracks, switches, and signals proved that everything outside of the locomotive was in good working condition, Commissioner D. Lane Powers okayed operations shortly thereafter on the Newark Bay Bridge from September the 27th. As the train started crossing the bay once again, the mystery only grew deeper. Some pointed towards the bridge itself, as at the time of the accident, it was nearing 100 years old. However, a massive renovation in 1927 essentially rebuilt the entire structure, and it now included the latest safety features at a cost of $14 million. Moreover, this bridge served many trains from across the entire region, with the main line running from Scranton via Wilkes-Barre. New Jersey Central operated from Newark south to Delaware Bay, visiting key resorts such as Atlantic City along the way. So there was no way to prove the cause of this accident conclusively. However, there are a few interesting consensuses resulting from other issues around the operator. For starters, the accident occurred on the Jersey Central, a company that began in 1849, having evolved from a ferry service in the years prior. By 1958, the company was operating in the shadows of bankruptcy, with deficits at $450,000 a month, or in today's money, that's $5 million monthly. With that in mind, a major railroad running operations at such a loss is a serious red flag. Sources suggest that staff was under extreme pressure, suffering fatigue, and perhaps most of all, budgets did not allow for the required maintenance. Hence, knowing that the engineer blew 3 signals, we can deduce he was either incapacitated or perhaps embracing the, let's say, Kurt Cobain philosophy. But here's the thing. We will never know, because the train's deadman switch was either disconnected or absent entirely, meaning had the engineer lost consciousness, there was no technical failsafe to stop it. And what makes this incident even more baffling is that fireman Peter Andrew, 42 at the time of the crash, was on board the locomotive to prevent exactly this situation. You see, when train locomotives transitioned from steam, companies realized that it was still useful to have a second pair of hands in the cab, so they kept the firemen around until the 1980s. Andrew was trained to stop the train in an emergency and should have done so. Then, as the media almost immediately began demonizing the engineer, the so-called Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers voiced their objection to what they considered, quote, a hasty and unfair attempt to align blame, asserting, quote, the Jersey Central's Newark Bay tragedy cannot be blamed on a dead man who cannot tell his side of the story. They went as far as hailing Wilburn, the engineer, as an experienced and skilled professional. Whatever the case, we can be sure that the signals were in working condition. Passenger George Barry witnessed all 3 in action, and the commission also confirmed their good condition after investigation. Finally, as I mentioned previously, Lloyd Nelson, another passenger on board, noticed that the drawbridge was open in plain sight of his window, recalling, quote, "By the time the car was in the water, I had the window open all the way. I swam to the surface and grabbed a hunk of piling that must have been knocked loose by the train, and I floated on it for about 300 yards until I was picked up." Officially, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the New Jersey Public Utilities Commission, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers each conducted separate inquiries into the wreck. All three found that the absence of a dead man's control was one of the primary causes of this disaster. After the inquiries, the New Jersey Public Utilities Commissioner ordered the railroads to install such devices on all passenger locomotives operating in the state of New Jersey. Some locomotives did have these devices on board, but this did not include the engine-leading train number 3314, at least certainly not on the day of the wreck. C&J claimed that such a device was not always necessary because all their trains had 2 crewmen in the locomotive cab. If an engineer were incapacitated, the fireman would assume control of the locomotive. And so again, considering that this was the exact scenario, it is mystifying why the train was never stopped. An autopsy found that engineer, 63-year-old Lloyd Wilburn, had indications of hypertensive heart disease, but that he had died of asphyxia due to drowning, meaning that he was alive at the time of the crash. However, no reason could be found to explain why fireman Peter Andrew, also in the locomotive, could not or did not stop the train. Investigators raised the wreckage and did not find any defect in the braking system on the locomotives or coaches. And hence, lacking more definitive evidence, it was presumed that the engineer had somehow become incapacitated in the cab, and the fireman failed to take appropriate action to stop the train. So the presence of a dead man's control in the locomotive might have averted the entire catastrophe. From there, C&J faced a number of legal actions, all of which were settled outside of court. The 2 locomotives, number 1532 and 1526, were raised, rebuilt by the Electromotive Division of General Motors, and returned to service. Locomotive number 1532 retained its original number, while 1526 was renumbered to 1531. They served primarily as freight locomotives, although 1532 was photographed in passenger service after its return. Now, as for the Newark Bay lift bridge, it was used until the last passenger train left Bayonne's 8th Street station on August the 6th, 1978. Demolition followed in July of 1980 after the United States Coast Guard declared the structure a navigational hazard to ships. The trestle and approaches were removed between 1987 and 1988 when it became apparent that the replacement span was no longer feasible. Satellite images of the area show a distinguished lead-up to where the bridge once was, with its final pilings in the water as late as 1995. Removal of those pilings began in 2012, and today, nothing remains. Nothing but memories, of course, and let's help keep those alive by sharing this story. I'd also like to thank the viewer who submitted this video idea. If you have an episode idea, please send it to me via this address on screen. Be sure to include a short description as well as a small image. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.